So, hello, good evening, welcome, or whatever time of day it is, wherever you may be. A question already. Will I offer this class again? Referring to the course, yes. Right, yeah, we'll get to that a little bit later, if that's okay, Gopi. There's a course I'm also running starting next week on the Hatha Pradipika, which I guess has got me focused on Hatha Yoga texts and talking about them a lot recently. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But there will be other opportunities if that's not a convenient time. So without further ado, let's dive in. As I say, feel free to just type at any time in the chat and also at the end to unmute if you would prefer. So for now, back to some slides. Me in an uncomfortable position, I'm no longer very good at, and really throwing out there the question, how long have people been doing that? It's often thought that the systems of yoga that are very popular around the world these days that are focused on postures have very long and ancient heritage. That was certainly my impression from the early classes I attended. And I remember the first time I opened Patanjali's Yoga Sutra and other such texts that I was being encouraged to read, feeling a little bit disappointed. There was none of this stuff in there. And it set me off on a journey that's taken me a fairly meandering route via study in India, study in academia, a never-ending process of study and reading books, writing a book, teaching courses, and constantly asking questions and trying to make sense of this basic question: how does what people call yoga today relate to all the things that have been called yoga in previous centuries? So looking specifically today at the physical practices generically known as Hatha Yoga, although Hatha itself is a particular phenomenon, and going to try and unpack that very briefly, a little sort of overview of the historical evolution of what we think of today as asana practice. For that, though, I think the easiest way in is to start with a famous modern teacher and see what he has to say, and unpack it a little bit. BKS Iyengar, a very influential figure in the development of modern postural yoga practice. I guess known as the founder of a system of yoga, which is branded Iyengar Yoga. Although when interviewed, he often used to say, that's not what I call it. I just call it yoga. And it's only got my name on it because people want to distinguish it from all the other types of yoga out there. But actually what I'm teaching is pure traditional yoga, he told Yoga Journal, 2008, from our ancestors, from our gurus, from Patanjali. And obviously there he's talking generally about the spirit and motivation, inspiring the practice, perhaps, rather than verbatim suggesting everything he teaches comes from the Yoga Sutras. But nonetheless, let's take it at face value, because I think that's how a lot of people read it, and see what we get if we go back to Patanjali's sutras on postural practice. After all, Iyengar, somewhere around here on my floor, I've got light on yoga. Misplaced it anyway. Got about 200 pictures of asanas in there. So yes, there we go. It's sometimes known as the Yoga Bible in some circles, because it lists all these postures and gives instructions. One of the earliest instruction guides that really had how-to on every level, from just sitting to making all sorts of shapes. And those are shapes that you don't find in the Yoga Sutra. You go to Patanjali's Yoga Sutra and you find this 3 lines, basically, plus another one which mentions the existence of a thing called asana. Asana for Patanjali means sitting. The only physical practice to be found in yoga texts before about 1,000 years ago is to be sat still. And Patanjali, in his 3 sutras on asana, talks about this. Says, your posture should be steady, it should be comfortable, but the steadiness and comfort are not something that you actually do by making an effort. You slide into steadiness and comfort by letting go into a deep state of meditative focus. And the result of that is that you're no longer troubled by pleasure and pain, the constant quest to make yourself happy, the dualities of the opposites, hot and cold, whatever it might be. There is even not concern with the problem of suffering. You go beyond the dichotomy of suffering and even liberation in the end, beyond the mind, beyond the possibility of conceptualization. You just sit down until that happens. Effectively, that's Patanjali's system of practice. So because he's got the word asana in there, because that gets associated with 8 steps, and the implication therefore being that modern yoga is, on this ladder, even though it's, perhaps getting a little bit focused more on asana than Patanjali, it's somehow still on the same trajectory. I would question whether that's the case, because Patanjali never had anything to say whatsoever about joining up postures and making that the practice. He says very simply that sit still. The commentary that accompanies the first of those sutras lists a bunch of ways that you can sit still, and they're all very clearly sitting positions. The ones in the left-hand column are still fairly familiar names for the most part. The one at the bottom, Sopashraya, means tying a yoga strap around your cross-legged position to make it easier to sit up straight. The ones in the right-hand column are a little bit more complicated. They're not so easily identified today, but the nishadana bit at the end of those 3 animal postures, the crane, elephant, camel, is the clue. It's to sit down like any of those animals. So it's pretty much unequivocal. That's all you find in yoga texts. Yoga goes back into ancient history. We don't really know how old yoga is, but all of the texts that are traceable from about 2,500 years onwards are talking about yoga in a very specific way. And it's summed up very clearly in this quote from the Mahabharata from about 2,000 years ago. Yoga is meditation. that is the practice of yoga. There are various ways that you can go about meditating. It does acknowledge there's other things that you can do to try and get into a state of yoga. Yoga was a state of perception, a way of experiencing reality. And meditation is said to be the most powerful way of going about this. And there are 2 options. So there is a physical practice in this early seated yoga. Patanjali mentions it. He says, if you're sitting in a stable position, you can also use control of the breath to help your mind become steady, to help the light of awareness be uncovered so that you can see through your confusion. And here we have in the Mahabharata exactly that. You can do something quite abstract, focus your mind on one-pointedness, is the way it's described in Sanskrit, or you can master the mind through the breath. But control of the breath, basically, certainly for Patanjali and in a lot of other early descriptions, means holding the breath. You still your mind by stilling your breath. You go beyond the need to do anything. So a lot of early yoga practice was very simply stillness. It's not moving, it's not making shapes, it's not joining them up. It's not to say that there isn't a way in which that can be done in harmony with these messages. We'll come back to that at the end. But for now, let's go deeper into this idea of staying still. Effectively, you're disappearing from conventional interaction with the world. The whole reason for stillness, stilling the mind, stilling the senses, is to disengage and to become sat like this chap with his nails curled up in his hands, emaciated, dreadlocked, indifferent to sensory satisfaction through interaction with the world outside. In fact, he's described as being yukta, his mind is yoked, he's engaged in yoga practice because he resembles a stone, and even more importantly, a piece of wood, because like this inanimate object, he doesn't desire anything. He just is. He has no hearing, smelling, tasting, seeing, touching, thinking going on in relation to the outside world. Because desire is the problem. Desire is the problem through which we get hooked on the idea of taking action in the world to seek satisfaction, to satisfy this me somewhere in the abstract mind that thinks it's only possible to be happy if we get what we want, or if we avoid all the things that we don't want. So the practice of yoga was a way to just shut down that machinery, not do anything ever again, and, be free from the problem of karma, be free from the cycles of birth, be free from suffering. But it's quite austere. It's perhaps not as likely to fill workshops in the 21st century as some of the things that have come along since. Now, there was also, alongside the sit still and disengage approach to yoga practice, another tradition of what is generally called by scholars today asceticism, doing difficult things to the body to achieve a similar objective. Literally, again, being still, immobilizing oneself, not acting. And the chief action that one isn't going to engage in when doing something like this, such as standing on one leg for many years at a time, holding an arm above one's head until it's impossible to bring it down even if you wanted to, is to avoid the action of coming out of this uncomfortable position, deliberately undertaking discomfort so as to detach from the sensory information, screaming, I want something different. That's a very mechanical, physical way to achieve a similar result. So although that's not really described in texts like the Yoga Sutra, there is a reference to the general idea that this is associated with. There's a word in Sanskrit, tapas, which refers to the cultivation of inner heat. And that goes back to the early Vedas as descriptions of the world coming into being through the intensity of tapas, the big bang, effectively, this singularity expanding out in explosion to create everything else in the world. The earliest practitioners of yoga perhaps inspired by this, the need to cultivate some intense self-discipline, either for the difficult put your body through discomfort approach, or the sit still and don't have any sensory involvement with the world approach. Either way, Patanjali says at the start of chapter 2 of the Yoga Sutra, this word tapas is a very important ingredient in what he calls kriya yoga. So the yoga of action, but the action is not to be involved in the world. It's the yoga of active disengagement from the world through understanding who we really are. And he says in the commentary accompanying that first sutra, yoga won't succeed unless you engage in tapas. Tapas is what burns through the impurity that keeps us confused. So literally, tapas means warmth, heat, fire. Comes from a verbal root to heat things up. But it's also, right from the earliest Vedas here, got the connotation of deliberate undertaking of discomfort in connection with some spiritual objective, bodily mortification, the dictionary puts it as. And I think that's really the basic message. The body is an obstacle. The body is what gets us entangled in the outside world, keeps us attached to the idea of me needing satisfaction through the senses, and is therefore the thing that has to be disciplined, has to be transcended, has to be basically let go of. Patanjali goes on to say you should desire to give up your body. That's the true motivation of the yoga practitioner in the commentary on Sutra 240, in case anyone's curious. And this was the basic message of all early descriptions of yoga. This is the earliest of them all, going back to the Katha Upanishad, maybe 2,300 years ago, roughly. But this is describing an orientation that probably goes back many centuries before that, of get everything under control. Patanjali says the same thing almost 1,000 years later. Still the mind, still the senses, no longer be confused about this misidentification with the stuff between the ears. Then a person is free from distractions, as the Katha Upanishad. Yes, because there's just no more sensory or cognitive activity. So it's not necessarily important to never act again, but that's the action that has to be shut down. And the easiest way to do it was to stop acting in the world, to stop allowing the body to drag us out into the world. So early yoga, all about that. And that's basically from as far back as yoga goes, certainly at least 2,500 years, perhaps some amount longer, up until about 1,000 years ago. Yoga was those two things, either put your body through pain or just sit there and shut it all down. But something starts to change 1,000 years ago, and that's where Hatha Yoga comes in. And this is influenced particularly by the philosophies generically grouped together by scholars under the umbrella label Tantra. Tantra is an enormous topic. I mean, Hatha Yoga history itself is an enormous topic to try and deal with in a very short time. I can't begin to do justice to Tantra. What I can do is to emphasize that it shifted people's relationship with the body. Most, even early tantric practitioners were ascetics, and they were still, withdrawing from the world, putting themselves through, extremely difficult and punishing practices. But over time, because of the philosophy of Tantra basically being connected to an energetic understanding of this explosion from the singularity out into the multiplicity of form and the possibility of connecting back through the body to that divine essence, it gave a whole new framework for practice. So there wasn't a need to mortify the body to be freed. There was the possibility of cultivating the body, cultivating energy flows within the body, installing the very energies of deities in the body, making oneself over, from this humble human flesh suit into something like the transcendent tattoos arraying that character in the picture. And these rituals that were part of tantric practice were, in many cases, expressly undertaken for the purpose of divinizing the body, as one scholar puts it, making it divine, or at the very least, making it so pure that it's as close to the divine as a human can get. And out of that come a whole new array of ideas about what you can do with the body, reasons for engaging with the body instead of disengaging from it, and an extra layer to all of the preceding ideas that go back, as far as you want to go in yoga history. So working with the breath in a different way, working with subtle channels through which the breath and other energies move in a different way, working even with putting the body into positions in a different way. And so this combination of tapas and tantra produces hatha. And that's what we get in medieval yoga. Suddenly a whole new approach seems to appear almost out of nowhere 1,000 years ago. There's no description of this sort of thing before that. Best known text on Hatha Yoga, the Hatha Pradipika, from about 600 years ago. So looking back on about 300 or 400 years of evolution of new ideas in itself, a bit like Patanjali compiling it all together and making a synthesis, starts talking about all sorts of new things. The idea of a goddess in the spine has to be awakened that shoots upwards, removing blockages and energetically dissolving the mind. So this cleared path is the central channel, the Sushumna Nadi, up the spine, potentially exploding out the top of the head into the 1,000-petaled lotus, etc., etc. All the ideas of chakra systems, other energetic ways in which the body can be manipulated so as to transform one's perception come from Tantra. And they become, I guess, combined with the physical techniques that earlier ascetics were using to make things move, to actively cultivate a heating up of potential in the body that can explode upwards and have all sorts of cosmic effects. So in very simple terms, that's what gets kind of incorporated from tantric practice into a different kind of practice. The practices of Hatha Yoga aren't taught in tantras. I mean, the most obvious example being this sort of thing, other things to do with the body than asceticism, hold your arm in the air forever, or just sit still. The two clearest examples of that being on the top left there, the earliest two non-seated postures to be taught in yoga texts, the arm balances Kukutasana and Mayurasana. Very difficult to hold them for years at a time. Very difficult to hold them for minutes. Some cases difficult to get into them without face planting. So there's a different motivation here. These postures are not being undertaken as ascetic austerities. They're also not really the way is to sit and meditate. I mean, yeah, maybe some can meditate in Mayurasana. It's beyond me, I have to say. So these have a different function. They're introduced in Hatha Pradipika as part of a 4-part system. So the sequence is not to join all of these postures together into a flow and lie down in Shavasana at the end, which is also included, but to use these different positions to stimulate something in the body, to prepare the body for subtler practices. The sequence that's described in the text is laid out at the end of the first chapter. After listing all these various asanas, it still comes back to saying the seated ones are the best, because you have to let go of posture at the end of chapter 1. Chapters 2, 3, and 4 are all about something else. They're about pranayama. They're about the techniques that move energy around the body, generically known as mudras. And in the 4th chapter, all about the same thing that Patanjali was interested in, the state beyond the mind. Samadhi. It's also given a dozen other names, including Raja Yoga, which is the king of yogas, and all these medieval Hatha Yoga texts effectively saying that although the physical practice is a great new tool, although it opens up a possibility of making that state more accessible, perhaps harnessing the energies of the body to attain something that would otherwise be very difficult, in the end, the goal is still beyond the body and beyond the mind. So it's increasingly subtle, it's increasingly inward focused, and it's increasingly seated. So although the non-seated postures pop up, you don't find in the medieval Hatha Yoga texts, the early Hatha Yoga texts, anything like what we would recognize today as postural yoga. So just to give some sort of, go back one, historical overview to clarify what it is I've been saying, there's really 2 big shifts that I've been describing in yoga history. One of them starting about 1,000 years ago, where 2 strands come together to make Hatha Yoga, the influence of tantric philosophy and the long-standing tradition of asceticism. And those 2 things are completely separate from many other texts that we associate with yoga, the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, the Mahabharata, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, the philosophies of Vedanta and Sankhya, and all of the things that they influence. That just trundles along the bottom of the timeline, pretty much irrelevant to these practitioners. They're not really interested in texts. The Hatha Yoga texts have got no philosophy for the most part. They just say, do this, do that, and the effects will happen. It's all about practice. So you've got phase 1, got to do something to deal with the problem of suffering, somewhere about 2,500 plus years ago. Phase 2, about 1,000 years ago, you can use the body in this project. There's still phase 3 before we get to modern yoga, somewhere between the 15th, 16th centuries and today. Something changes in which asana practice becomes a means all unto itself, in a way, of achieving the objectives of yoga. And that's what we need to look at just a little bit more now to understand the evolution from medieval Hatha Yoga to modern yoga. Because things get quite unclear in this next phase, and they're hotly disputed because it casts doubt on some of the stories that are told by modern lineages about where they come from. So the Hatha Pradipika teaches 15 postures about 600 years ago. As we move on through the centuries, going down this chart into the 17th and 18th centuries, texts start to teach more and more postures. And as this scholar, Jason Birch, notes, by the time we get to the one at the bottom, the Hatha Abhyasa Paddhati from the 18th century, there's a huge variety of things you can do with the body. There's bending forwards, backwards, and twisting, balancing, putting your leg behind your head. All sorts of things are there, but there are some things that are not there. And that's where the problems start. Most of what you see on this chart is not there. The sun salutations and the wide-legged standing postures that make up the start of the Ashtanga Vinyasa primary series and are also the sort of staples of the average flow yoga class. All this stuff, there's no trace of in ancient yoga texts. It's quite likely that this is a much more recent development, a fusion of some of the techniques of asana practice, the philosophy behind that asana practice, and other things out there in the world inspiring physical practice. And this is where it starts to get controversial because no one really knows where these things have come from. They can't be proven because there's no surviving evidence. There's no texts that list them from a long time ago. And there's also no way of documenting absolutely without a shadow of a doubt where they have crept in from. So you tend to get an argument between traditionalists and yoga scholars. And this is about as provocative as the yoga scholars get. Mark Singleton's book, Yoga Body, which came out a dozen years ago, annoyed a lot of people, but it's a fascinating read that presents a lot of unignorable evidence. And his conclusion from it really is that we can't say that modern yoga is a direct development from ancient Hatha yoga. There are some new ingredients that come into the mix, and the biggest ingredient is the idea that it's all about the body. Yoga for body cultivation. It develops in early 20th century India, long before Instagram influencers get their hands on it. And yoga for the body, for the world, health and wellness approach to yoga starts about 100 years ago. The system of Ashtanga Vinyasa starts even more recently than 100 years ago. BKS Iyengar learned alongside the guy who popularized Ashtanga, Patabi Joys, from a teacher, Krishnamacharya, who was very innovative in this process of revolutionizing yoga practice about 100 years ago. So lots of things have changed in the last century. That doesn't mean that all things taught today are brand new. Quickly come in with Bebel's question because I think it's very relevant here. People were so annoyed by Mark Singleton's book because it basically says that the stories that modern gurus have told about what they teach, that, for example, the Ashtanga Vinyasa sequences date back to the Vedas, they're just not true. And because the way he wrote it was quite detached, quite scholarly, quite critical, and because he was very much focused on a 20 or 30 year period in which a lot of these changes took place, people misunderstood him, I think. They misunderstood this message to be saying everything that you think of as traditional yoga has been invented in the last 100 years by combining various different systems of European gymnastics and calling that new sort of spiritual calisthenics Hatha yoga, and it's not. And he was saying something related to that by producing lots of interesting evidence to look at. He was saying, we don't know how you get from the medieval era to the modern era because there's some new things come in. We just don't know where they've come from. And if he'd phrased it a little bit more open-mindedly, I think perhaps it would have been easier for people to swallow, but he was still going to challenge the stories that were being told. And those who were attached to those stories were not going to like it very much. And here's a great example. Here is one of these gymnastics manuals from the early 20th century. The Danish instructor Niels Buch, very influential. This stuff was being taught in schools in India under British colonial occupation. And so there's this cross-cultural exchange of ideas that may well have been an inspiration for introducing some new positions into a sequence of dynamic practice that makes traditional ideas of yoga compatible with the requirements of modern practitioners, wanting a dynamic, focused way of doing something for a short period rather than going to live in a cave that could be compatible with everyday life, also compatible with the resistance taking place in India at that time to colonial occupation, building up the body to build up the strength as a nation, to build up national pride. So although these new systems of yoga might have borrowed some things from other places, they still had a very strong anchor in traditional ideas of what yoga was for. But that does start to get blurred because, as Mark Singleton uncomfortably points out, the priorities get less and less spiritual and more physical. So Gopi asks, what do you think about Krishnamacharya's claim that the sequences were mystically found on leaves, or the connection to his ancestor Natamuni, who supposedly revealed his teachings in a dream to the young Krishnamacharya, dictated, in fact, this text he called the Yoga Rahasya, the secret of yoga. I think that's what we see with people like Krishnamacharya and those kinds of stories, that if you want to find the origin of what he taught, you have to go and look for a manuscript that's unfortunately vanished, is an attempt to disguise his own creativity. Because the ways that tradition evolves in India is to respectfully reinterpret the same old stories. You're supposed to creatively shed new light on the same old idea. You're not supposed to invent a whole new idea and rip it up. That's unorthodox. That becomes non-Hindu if you do that. That's what the Buddha did. He said no to all this Brahmin stories. So if you want to stay within, you know, the confines of convention, I mean, Krishnamacharya was a learned Brahmin. To stay within that, you know, conventional worldview, you have to be very creative and not say I've invented new things, but instead, you know, have them revealed in a dream, or, you know, transmitted by a guru in Tibet who was, you know, the sole repository of thousands of postures that nobody else had access to. So in a way, it's humble. It's actually, you know, it's quite yogic. It's not self-centered. It's not me and my yoga. And that's all Iyengar, I think, was doing at the beginning as well. He's saying, although his book's full of inventions, there's postures in here that you don't find anywhere else. And there's postures that he invented after writing the same book. But he, you know, didn't want to take the credit for that. Instead, he wanted to say it's all traditional yoga because it's got the spirit of traditional yoga practice. So I guess we have to interrogate where that comes from as well. But just to come back to this sort of scholarly debate around it, some people these days like to suggest that there are other yoga scholars who think there's much more of a connection, and that they're perhaps therefore saying something different to Mark Singleton. But I think all scholars who look, you know, at the evidence have the same conclusion, which you see in the second part of this quote. There is no pre-modern evidence for the complex sequences of linked postures taught as ancient in many modern yoga schools. I mean, they might exist, but we haven't got any evidence to prove that they did before the 20th century, really. And there's some sign from the 18th century onwards of joining things together. Increasingly, the dynamism of practice starts to appear. There's probably the sort of traditions that inspired someone like Krishnamacharya. But even so, the basic methods are still the same. There is a connection back to the past in the idea of working with the body to go, you know, to something subtler than the external body. So they're the source of much of the yoga practice around the world today, but they're not necessarily in the same spirit. And yeah, it's very hard to say which is traditional, which is modern. For example, there in the pictures at the top, also from the work of Jim Mallinson, comparing a sadhu at the Kumbh Mela in India with a famous internet active modern Ashtanga yoga teacher performing the same asana, which isn't found in any text before the modern era, known in the Iyengar tradition as Kala Bhairavasana, and the Ashtanga one just as Bhairavasana, Bhairava's posture, the name associated with Shiva in some of the really hardcore out there tantric texts, but they don't talk about Bhairavasana. So it's very difficult to tell, you know, which things have been borrowed from where, and westernized yoga is now very popular in India also. So it's backwards and forwards. It's hard to unravel. But let's move towards the end and open up for more questions, because otherwise I could talk for hours. Just come back to where we started with BKS Iyengar. The reason he makes the claim he does, I think, although he never said this clearly in any of his books, is because Patanjali sanctions the idea that you can, in the end, meditate on anything you like. It's the 39th sutra of the first chapter of the Yoga Sutra. So you can steady your mind if you just pay attention to whatever you're doing. So walking meditation, mindful washing up, it's possible to get a steady mind. The question really as to whether it's yoga or not, though, is what happens with your steady mind? What do you do with the steady mind? Do you use it to fire a gun, or to trade stocks, or for some other higher purpose? That's where yoga comes in, the question of why we're doing all of this stuff, and also a little bit how we're doing it, I think, as well. But nonetheless, Iyengar was saying, I train people to be one-pointed by shouting instructions at them. Oops, I've jumped a slide. Here we go. So he's saying, if I am giving you a blizzard of instructions, details for where to position your bodies into correct alignment, your mind is fully absorbed in the physical action. You can't therefore be drifting off, as he puts it, wondering what's for dinner, whether you're going to be promoted or demoted at work. Instead, you're mindfully present in your body. So the body is being used as a tool, and that is very much in the spirit of medieval Hatha Yoga. It's just remixed for the modern era. Finding a way to use the body to see beyond the body, to see beyond the mind, to see something clearer. And he also taught pranayama, perhaps less interested in some of the funkier practices you find in the Pradipika and other medieval texts. But still, modern gurus are drawing on the old ideas, but they're producing something relevant to the time in which they're teaching. Today, the innovation continues. Nothing stops, nothing is static. Yoga is always evolving. And the one message that really want to hammer home from my book, but really I think just from the interaction of my two, I guess, major influences, studying with scholars and studying in India, is that although people like to talk about, the one true yoga, and it's all the same, it's all come from this common source and many paths, one goal, I think the reality is there are many different approaches to yoga. Yoga is always changing, and people are inventing things all the time and trying to disguise it. So I guess the responsibility for us in the modern era is perhaps to be a little bit more honest about that, especially since it's not our tradition in a way. We're inheritors of it. The respectful engagement with it when we're being a bit creative and inventing new teachings involves admitting that that's what we're doing, rather than pretending it's all come from Patanjali, or that he talks about asana sequences. But in the end, though, there is no one true yoga, and therefore we have to ask ourselves, what makes something yoga? What, even more to the point, makes something not yoga? Where do we draw that line? There is no clear answer, and I'm certainly not the yoga police, so I haven't got the magic solution. What I do think, though, is that it's less about what is done and a lot more about why, and to a certain extent also how. That's where the yoga comes in. And many different things can be approached in a yogic way, therefore, as people tend to suggest, with all of the various different compounds we get in the modern yoga marketplace, of different approaches to yoga. But not all of them, I think, deserve the yoga suffix. So I guess it's up to us to be discerning. So it's a sort of very roundabout way of saying, yoga's changed a lot, but it can still be connected to tradition, even when the practices themselves have been quite innovative. So that's almost enough from me. One thing I did want to draw attention to, though, which Gopi raised at the beginning, is this course that's starting next week, where we will read through the whole of the Pradipika, the best known text about physical yoga, and then meet on Zoom like this on Sundays to talk things through. Be less of me talking, more of everybody who shows up, basically asking questions, sharing ideas. There's a course site where there are discussion forums, there are questions to prompt reflections, and there are, for each week's module, 2 hours of pre-recorded videos exploring each of the chapters in detail, highlighting not just what's going on in this text, but what's been going on in the preceding centuries of yoga history that have inspired this new development of medieval hatha yoga, and then also how all of that relates to what people do today. So it's a sort of distilled focus on the 1,000 years of physical yoga history that I've touched on just now. If you're watching today, you're very lucky, because I'm offering you a discount if you sign up before the start of the course. So before midnight on Sunday, you can get a discount of 10% if you use this code hatha_10. So that should be good for any sign up. If you've already signed up and you want to sign up for another course, you can also use the code for that as well. So I think that's probably enough from me, otherwise we'll run out of time for questions. If we don't have time for your question, you can always reach me via my website, the address there, danielsimpson.info/contact. And let me just type in the chat as well, the address to get to the course if you would like to find out more. There's lots more about it on the course site, but I don't want to get too bogged down in talking about that. I'd rather get talking about anybody's questions. I'm aware there were some that popped up that I haven't yet answered, so I better get back to that. So there's the link, and there is the code, so you can copy paste and use those. Right, stop sharing the screen and come back to the room. So thank you everyone for your one-pointed focus on that whistle-stop tour of yoga history. I'm going to go back to the top of the list, and I'll come back to you, Vishal, unless you wanted to ask the question you've already typed out loud. It's up to you. I was going to come back and answer your first question first.
Well, it's kind of related actually anyway.
Yeah.
So it's a two-part question. The paradigm shifts in yoga seem to be very neatly categorized by scholars. And so there's almost these sharp turns in history. So I wondered the fluidity really between these phases. I don't know how much you can expand on that. And then each phase conveniently weave in the Yoga Sutras because that's the preeminent phase. But what Patanjali describes is very different even to Hatha Yoga. And it almost seems, a part of me thinks the Hatha Yogins were trying to fit in Patanjali. I mean, obviously from their point of view, meditation was very much the end goal. But yeah, I just think each phase seems to be fitting, weaving in the Yoga Sutras. But anyway.
Well, I think actually, to be honest, one of the things that scholars have made quite clear, and I think they're right in this, is there's actually Patanjali it's not irrelevant. He's there as the source, sort of. I sometimes describe it as the Wikipedia article on yoga meditation, summing up everything that's been said previously, adding some new explanations that make it very clear. You know, this is the bullet point summary of meditative yoga practice, and because it gets this status of the source text of the yoga school of philosophy, it's copied and passed on, but it's unclear what it was used for. It seems to be more of a reference document that certainly by the 19th century, when translators went looking for Brahmins to help them put it into English, they could find people who knew it, people who could help them understand the meaning of it, but they couldn't find anybody who was practicing it. And even this guy, Hari Harananda Aranya, who's probably written one of the best books on the Yoga Sutra, translating the whole of the commentary in there. It's originally in Bengali, but now translated into English. He himself couldn't find a guru who could teach him Sankhya Yoga. He had to figure it out for himself from the textual tradition. So I think what happens more and more is because yoga becomes more and more mainstream and more suited to something you can do while being in society, rather than being a world-renouncing philosophy, things get mixed and matched. So there was a slide I had with a timeline. The last phase of the timeline, which is really where particularly Jason Birch's scholarship has been focused, is to look at what happens in this fertile period from the 17th and 18th centuries, when lots of new, much longer texts get composed. They've got many more practices in them, but they also start to bring back all of this philosophy. And I think in the context of Hatha Yoga, there's a commentary that goes with the Hatha Pradipika. We'll be dipping into this as part of the course as well. I mean, this is only a translation of part of it. The full thing is in there in Sanskrit if you're feeling keen. But a lot of the time, Brahmananda, this 19th century commentator, cites Patanjali in explaining what the Hatha Pradipika is teaching. But that's him adding in this other material that the scholars know about that does obviously relate to the goals of practice, because the goals of practice are the same whether you're looking at a yoga text or not. See beyond confusion, find out who you really are, and stop causing unnecessary suffering. That's there. It's simple, and it's involves seeing beyond the mind. So that is still very clearly there in the Hatha Yoga tradition. But you're right, the approach is totally different. It's using the body rather than seeing the body as an obstacle. It's not really talking about philosophy. It doesn't have a philosophical framework. Patanjali's system is all about seeing the difference between the mind and consciousness. The fourth chapter of the Hatha Pradipika says union of these two things is what sets you free. So it's almost turning Patanjali upside down and inside out. So I think they're just separate traditions, really, and they come together in the modern world for the main reason that Patanjali has got an authoritative text, it's got the word asana in it, and therefore these inventive 20th century teachers can reach for it and say, look, I've got a traditional sanction for my asana-focused approach. So back to Gopi's question about Krishnamacharya, I think that's one of the reasons he put such a focus on Patanjali when describing a system that really didn't have very much to do in terms of the practices with what Patanjali was teaching. He was much more inspired by late medieval Hatha Yoga texts. So let me undo the slide share and come back to the chat so I can see what else is in there. Seba asked, will there be a recording? Yes, I've recorded, so I'll share that afterwards. Let's scroll down a bit. oh, Chris asking, can I type the title of the book you just referenced? Is that this Hatha Pradipika one with the commentary, Chris? Is that the one you meant?
The Hari Harananda one, please.
Ah, yes, yeah. The Yoga Philosophy of Patanjali is the way it's titled. So it's a full translation of the commentary that goes with the Yoga Sutras, traditionally attributed to Vyasa, along with Hari Harananda's own analysis as well. And you can actually find that at the moment. I don't know how long it'll stay. It's often these things don't last long, on the website archive.org. I think I might even have that to hand. Yes, I do. I was looking at it yesterday, so I'll give you the link so you can get yourself a PDF while it lasts.
Thank you very much. Why not? Eh?
Well, there you go. So another question, I'll go back up from Nagopi. Yoga Yajnavalkya later than the Hatha Yoga Pradipika? Probably not, probably before. I forget what date Mallinson and Singleton give it in their Roots of Yoga. My Roots of Yoga has fallen to bits. I've had to give it a new cover. It's such a useful book. Perhaps not the easiest bedtime read, but I keep going back to it again and again and again. So let me find their timeline. And I think it's I don't see it there. I thought they had that around the 13th, 14th century, but I could be wrong. It certainly draws on ideas from texts around that time. I'll look it up, but I think it's another sort of synthesis of ideas. It also gets updated, a bit like the Hatha Pradipika. Although we have this version now with 4 chapters, scholars have been putting together all the different manuscripts that you find over the centuries and observing. I mean, there's a 10-chapter version, a 6-chapter version, and clearly, therefore, the text keeps being added to as the centuries go by. And so they're now trying to piece together which of those editions are what we might call canonical, that come back, to the original source material, and which ones are added in as time goes by to make new teachings sound old again. I'll see if I can find that date though. I'll search around one of my files while I'm doing something else. So going back up, Berbelas. Where would you draw the line? What is still yoga? What is not? I find it so difficult. I don't think I can actually give a clear answer. I think actually, I mean, this is probably my clearest answer that I can give is we have to keep asking the question. I think yoga is about asking questions. When we think we've got the answer, that's what fixes things. And that's coming back to what Vishal was asking originally about scholars, why the scholarly world can sometimes sound a bit weird to yoga practitioners, because it puts things into boxes and speaks with certainty about things that are actually quite uncertain, and the scholars will admit that when you push them to, but you don't get published if you say, oh, it's all very uncertain. Instead, you have to take a clear position. So I think yoga is a practice of inquiry. Yoga is a practice of asking questions. I mean, if you don't have to ask any more questions, you're enlightened. So congratulations. For myself, I've got plenty of questions. So I think just as long as one is asking, is this yoga, one is probably on the right track. Some of the criteria, though, that we do find again and again and again are, the problem is me. The problem is in here. The more attached I am to me and my self-satisfaction, the greater the possibility of being confused. But that's not to say that we should all become, boundaryless doormats, offering ourselves up to be stamped all over by, the ruthless forces in the modern world. You need to be discerning, find the moment to, remember I've got a personality and it's useful and I can get a job with it, but also not getting too attached to it so that you can tune out of it later and slip into some meditation. So it's a process of, wearing different hats for different situations, I think. That's part of the practice of discernment, asking questions. When do I need to see the world one way and when do I need to see it another way? So when it comes to what's yoga, I think just asking the question is a good place to start. But for us to do that, we first have to have some criteria. So the other thing I would always come back to is, traditionally yoga has been about freedom from suffering. It's taken many forms. Once upon a time, that was freedom from suffering. To me, that looks like suffering, so I'm not going to go there. But I'm going to try and find other ways of first of all, having the intention to decrease suffering for myself and for others, or at least not add unnecessary suffering if I possibly can help it. And then at the same time, I have to pay attention to whether or not I'm living up to that intention. So yoga is a practice of cultivating, this clarity so that you can do something with it. So you have to have a reason, I think, as well, for it to be yoga. Otherwise, it's just getting a sharp, focused mind. And this book that I helped to edit, Mindfulness, talking about the ways in which modern attention training is misused in all sorts of ways to basically just grease the wheels of capitalism. Should make us think twice about assuming that the practice itself teaches us how to behave. I think that we have to think about how we want to behave and then use whatever we get from the practice to make that more likely. So where are we on the list of questions? I think going back down again. Michelle saying, I heard Dr. Jim say he's still not entirely sure what Hatha Yoga is. This suggests that Hatha Yoga research is ongoing. We haven't had the final word or consensus. Well, actually, Jim Mallinson has been very declarative in recent times. Since the Hatha Yoga project, which was a 5-year research program at SOAS, the University of London, between 2015 and 2020, since that wound up, he's been quite forthright in saying some things that I thought he was a little bit more circumspect about, particularly this fact that Hatha Yoga was a new thing 1,000 years ago, because there's no evidence of it before that. And I think he's right. I certainly don't have any evidence of it from before that time. But I think always we have to insert the caveat that our only available information is texts, and texts are a tiny layer of what was actually happening at that time. It's all we've got, so we have to make the most of it. There's no point saying we can't know anything because we've only got texts. But I think we have to be a bit careful of assuming that just because we haven't got the evidence, that's the proof that it didn't happen. We need to, I think, always just remind ourselves and each other that much is unknown. And Jim will say all that when you press him on it. It's just he's become very declarative about it. 1,000 years ago, something changed, and particularly one text that was very influential, out of which a lot of the practices have come. The practices of mudras, in particular, moving energy around the body. That's just the first text that wrote it down. It doesn't necessarily mean those were the guys who had the ideas. It's always ideas are flying around. We just don't know where they were and who else was using them because we can't go back in time and eavesdrop. So let's come down. The influence of capitalism is daunting. I totally agree. If we could through just love and light explode the bubble, that would be wonderful. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to work that way. So if we see the causes of suffering not just in our own minds but in the structural forces around us, I think yoga becomes connected to not necessarily activism. That's not necessarily for everybody, but certainly to seeing clearly how the world is not necessarily helping those who live in it because people are behaving badly and setting up institutions in ways that cause suffering. And part of yoga, I think, can be socially engaged as a result. It's possible to turn around that old idea of we have to retreat from the world. And that's been going on for 2,000 years. The Bhagavad Gita has a philosophy of being in the world and trying to do the right thing. So I think there's a traditional precedent for making that connection. But a lot of people say, I don't want yoga and politics mixed. I'm not a huge fan of politics myself, but the politics is just the living in the world. Effectively, that's where it comes from the Greek word, the polis, being in society. So if you live in the world, life is unfortunately political. So Eric asked, what was the title of this classic Hatha Yoga scripture? The Hatha Abhyasa Paddhati. And there is a recent article about that written by Mark Singleton and Jason Birch in the Journal of Yoga Studies. You can Google the title and this source and you'll find it immediately. And they write at length about the text itself, about what it teaches, and also how it connects to some of Krishnamacharya's innovations. Sorry, Anna, you already answered. I apologize. Thank you. Right, where are we? So I think I've caught up. are there any other questions? Anything else anyone would like to raise? Yes, Eleanor.
Hi, Daniel.
Hey, nice to see you.
Nice to see you. Happy to be here. I would like to ask something about what Patanjali says at the very beginning of Yoga Sutra. Yogaha chitta vritti nirodha. No, is the stilling of the vrittis, of the fluctuation of the mind, which is amazing. And but how to be aware of vritti, because this is perhaps I live my life, in personal, I mean, we live our lives without be aware of this noise inside most of the time.
Well, that's what he says in the fourth sutra, basically. You know, the problem is we're lost in the mind. The third sutra says, you know, wonderful, if you can still your mind, you'll have no obstacle, you'll be enlightened, the self will rest in its true nature. So I think it's he starts at the end, it's a very advanced statement that yoga is the stilling of the mind, because who here has got a still mind? I certainly haven't. My mind that jumps around and plays tricks on me all the time. So I think the practice, in a way, is to be paying attention to that. And that's you know, the simplest form of meditation, in a way, to have as your meditative object watching your mind. Just watch what it does, you know, instead of tuning into it and, you know, being absorbed in the thoughts, to actually see them. Just can't do that all day long, otherwise it's almost like dissociation. But as a practice, instead of looking at the phone at the bus stop, just be like, what's going on in my mind? And just to see the stories it comes up with. It's something that happens naturally. If you go on a long meditation retreat, you just sat there, there's nothing else to do, and the mind is just, you know, it's throwing things for observation. It keeps bringing up old memories. It keeps, you know, saying, oh, and there's that thing that somebody said to me this time, 20 years ago, and eventually it becomes possible just to say, another one, look. And to even just sort of feel the energy attached to that, that's sort of held in the body, and, you know, and to see how we're conditioned by because that's what Patanjali is talking about in practice. Not just the vrittis. It's easy to get hung up on vrittis because that's what he says in the second sutra, but it's really what he goes on to say about the vrittis, which is that they can be either klishta or aklishta. They can either cause us pain or not. So it's not even the problem that we've got things in the mind. It's the problem is the klishta vrittis, the ones that have kleshas in them, that have affliction, that are caught up in this problem of me, my life, getting what I want, trying to avoid the things I don't like, and above all, fear of death. So all the time that's active, there will be difficult vrittis. So it's a process actually of seeing how that works, paying attention to what he talks of in terms of samskaras and vasanas, seeing how we're conditioned by our experience. So, you know, in some ways, a good yoga practice is to go to psychotherapy and pay attention to patterns in the mind. Obviously, one can get totally lost in that and become really self-centered and self-absorbed about me and my problems, which isn't the same thing. So it's striking a balance between engaging enough to sift through it and see where there's problem, and actually just try to see how that works. It's a psychological analysis, I think, that Patanjali is presenting there. He's saying all the time that that's happening, it's impossible to liberate yourself from the mind. And I think for myself, I'll be stuck with that problem for most of my life. I'm not expecting to get beyond it. But if I can turn down the volume, that would be nice. So I see my practice as being a way to try and do that. And sometimes it doesn't even need to be formally sitting. It's just, you know, being able to see when the mind is doing unhelpful things, and just being able to stop and go, whoa, okay, all right, I don't need to repeat that pattern. I've been round that circuit too many times. So where are we? A couple more here. What's the attitude in academic scholarship towards oral tradition versus physical written text? Very good question. I think the honest answer is skepticism. And I understand it, really, I have to say. I think there's good reasons for that, because you know, in the end, what the scholarly community is trying to do is assemble available reliable evidence that you can point to and say, this is what it shows us. So that doesn't mean it tells us everything, but it does tell us that that's what that text says. And we can even drill down further and say, we know that there were different versions of that text, and that this version became the popular one and got passed on, and that one just died out and got neglected for whatever reason. And then we can start to have theories about all of that. So, I mean, it's like science and what it can measure. Not everything can be measured. No one's got a measuring machine for consciousness yet. It just is. It doesn't rule out other things. And I think so long as that's admitted, then there is no problem. But when it gets a bit too dogmatic, and the idea that the texts are the only reliable thing and everything else is unreliable, we just sort of miss the reality of how people are. It would be like trying to know somebody from their social media account rather than by living in their head. It's just not possible to know everything, but at least if we admit that we don't know everything, and that the thing that we're looking at can only be a partial summary, then that's helpful. But in the end, the problem with the oral tradition, especially in the modern world, because there are a lot of stories told that we're asked to believe on the authority of lineage, that are used for political reasons in modern India to establish narratives about the Hindu nature of the Indian state, and the antiquity of things that aren't necessarily as old as people say, which is, it gets very controversial very quickly. And if the only sort of argument that can be put forward is people say it's very old, then you can't really have the two worlds communicating with each other, because the scholarly world is coming back with, I don't know, DNA evidence and text dating, and all sorts of other things relating to what other cultures have had to say about their interaction with Indian culture. And that might not be the whole story, but it is something that's verifiable, whereas we can't verify what people say. But that doesn't mean that has no value. Stories are how we live. We make sense of life through stories. The word myth, I think, tells us what we really need to know about an oral tradition. It's understood in common use in the modern world in English to mean something that's not true. And that's not really what a myth is. A myth is a narrative that gives us meaning and helps us to structure our understanding. And so if an oral tradition is understood in that way, then it has a richness that's alive and is different. But it might not still at the same time be able to give us accurate information about dating. So I think we have to see that they have different functions, perhaps in terms of what evidence and what relationship they have to practice. And perhaps for most practitioners, the oral tradition's got more richness, it's got more juice, it's got more relevance to what practitioners are doing. But if there's a curiosity, an interest in inquiry into history in particular, and whether stories can be, I guess, backed up in some way with some other corroborating information, then we have to look in a different place for different kinds of information. So any other questions? We're getting past 8 o'clock, so I'll slowly move towards winding up. But if there is anything anybody else wants to ask, I'll put again in the chat my website contact page, where you're welcome to write to me anytime. And to just remind you again, it'd be lovely to have you with us for the Hatha Pradipika course, in which we'll be going into much more depth about all of this, and we can meet and talk to our heart's content about all of these topics over 4 consecutive Sundays. And back to Gopi's original question, which was the live sessions take place on Sunday evenings. So I will run the course live at the moment. If you can't make it on Sunday evenings, those sessions are recorded. It's also possible to ask questions in advance by email and then get them answered in the recording. It's possible to ask questions at any time via the course site. It's even possible, if you really want to record yourself speaking your question and send it to me, and then I can even play that out, sharing the screen as part of our live session, so you can be there in person even if you're not. And if you can't be there live, it will be possible to study the course independently once we've finished. And at some point, again, I will run it live, but I don't yet know when that will be. I only know that right now I've got one starting on Monday. So if you'd like to be there, you've got a code to get a discount, and it would be lovely to have you with us. So I think that's enough from me for now, and I look forward to seeing some of you again soon. And thank you all for lots of good questions. And if you do have any others, yeah, as I say, please feel free to be in touch. Okay, thanks again. Have a good evening or afternoon or whatever time of day it is. I think Gopi's out there on the West Coast, so perhaps, yeah, it is afternoon now just. Cool. Okay, take care. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
So much.
Thank you.